Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Well, my darlings, we start a new chapter in Urban Fae today. It's a 5-parter, and this chapter is entitled The Selkie Feud by Bearlair64, aka Michael Lockhart. I was really tired of funerals. Biggie Ass, aka Solomon Blankard Biles, was about to be laid to rest. Despite the best efforts of Lieutenant Falk, word got out that there had been shots fired at Sony's club. The medical examiner had tied up the big dude's body in storage with a drawn-out autopsy and review. Then the family had to fool around and fight over the details and inheritances, while his outsized remains resided on ice in the funeral home basement. It seems Biggie S had made the rounds and produced many little S's with numerous ladies. It had been 2 months since the Battle of BAE View. I didn't really want to be there, but I'd promised Sony that we'd help him with Serpente. Never mind that I had my own bone to pick with that earthling. The best way to do that was to reestablish some ties with the various fractions of mortal turds. Shabal, Skittles, has been doing his part and had all but put himself in position to inherit Sony's block when the old reprobate either died or grew too fog-brained to run things. A screech arose from the front of the big church, and I tensed, ready for an attack. It was just another female relative or associate having a Takalodes, a screaming, wailing fit, which, oh lordy, is repeated loudly in staccato fashion. The string of lordes, usually beginning with a shriek and ending with a wail. It was like a comical version of the banshee's wail. I stifled a laugh at the absurdity of people competing to see who could grieve the loudest, and Sorsha pinched me. She'd only been herself for a couple of days, since midsummer solstice, but she was completely healed, so it had been worth the wait. I almost lost it again when an image of her trying to pinch me with seal flippers popped into my mind. Don't get me wrong, I felt badly enough for those left behind by old Biggie S. I was simply in an exuberant mood. I had Sorsha, and she was alive and well, and her breath no longer smelled of raw fish. I made the mistake of telling her that when we were on the way to the service, she'd harumphed and replied, "At least I don't have cat breath from chewing on, Kortka." Touché. We'd left MB at the stable in Wyoming. Gotta love those portals. I found out that a fae from the Western Plains horse clan named Fiona ran a horse ranch up that way. She'd married a mortal cowboy, now long dead, and had fallen equally in love with that little slice of mundania. She'd invited MB there many times to sample the fillies, and during his visits she played TV in the barn for the visiting fae horse and his contemporaries among the long-lived equines to keep them occupied. They tended to be far more intelligent than mundane horses, but were still dumb enough to enjoy the dretch and drivel of that medium. Fiona had shown me his papers. His official legal name was Manfred Bravo, MB. The private joke on me when I'd first dubbed him MB. He watched my reaction as I read the document, and we shared a laugh. I shrugged and said, "Your papers give you a more dignified name, but Mighty Bike is cooler." We laughed some more and settled on MB as being the best handle for him, and our own little bonding joke. The ranch was a relaxing place for him to unwind from his ordeals, and I was happy to oblige. He was, after all, a noble steed, and a good friend. Fiona was happy to have such a sire for her colts. One of the MacTier Moor's horses, Archatrix, had succumbed to her injuries. Her sister, Optrix, had survived, but grandfather and Guerre decided that it was time for her to retire and help train another team. Fey animals tend to be smarter, more vigorous, and longer-lived than their counterparts in Mundania, but they were far from immortal. The chariot horses had been no more than 80 years old, M-time, still in their prime. Grandfather had taken us home as soon as we found out that Sorsha would recover. He was, after all, a high lord of his clan, our clan, and had duties and obligations to attend. When Artrix at last slipped from life, I'd sat for hours and listened to Guerre lament the loss of the Grand Beastie. I learned that chariot teams were both born and trained to their tasks, and that the sweet, fierce lass was exceptionally good and required only the merest flick of rein for direction. Guerre and I had never spoken much. He was taciturn by nature, and I'd always been busy with lessons from my elder, or plotting obstreperous activities with both of them. Yet that evening we bonded because I listened to him. In his words, "You be a true Fey lord and all, but I still listen to the blubber of a poor henchman in his grief. It's a fine thing, and you are much like your sire and grandsire. Thought you'd have some strange ways in speech. I suppose that's why they left you there, though, to learn the manner of—" He caught himself and pretended to snuffle back some tears. He thought he'd given away some tremendous family secret that was not his to tell. But I suspected for a while that my family had meant for me to experience Mundania for a number of years, to develop instincts for that environment. I just didn't know the purpose. After all, the big bad wolf seemed rather contemptuous of that world. He'd imparted the secret when he was ready, if there was one to impart. I'd learned that Guerre was from a family of mortals that had been transported to Otherworld in centuries past. They became part of the long-lived, not truly Fey, but they benefited greatly from the association with immortals. They didn't get sick and aged slowly for a long time, then rapidly for a short one. They made up the majority of the inhabitants of Otherworld, at least among the Anthros, beings with anthropomorphic form to greater and lesser degrees. Many of the beings possessed different forms. They were no less intelligent or capable than Anthros, just different in form, function, mind, and purpose. Others were more like regular animals, only better, more so, perhaps a truer essence of them. I found that it was best when the Otherworld to assume that beings were more powerful and intelligent than mortal versions, until they were proven otherwise. After all, many were from the other worlds, other planets under different stars, which accounted for the tapestry of landscapes that one encountered on travels in the Otherworld. The multiverse was a big place. Otherworld was mostly a highway that traversed it while at the same time existing as a place of its own. The inhabitants called it the living world and referred to all others as the dying worlds. Maybe the translation would have been better rendered as the cycling worlds, where life and death begat one another in waves and circles. It could get confusing, the grand scale of it all, even the scale of a single world, Mundania, which was apparently some grand crossroads, truly a Middle Earth. The hub world was at times staggering and at times simple. If we could get through all the current conflicts, perhaps Sorsha and I would be able to explore. We stayed at Kar Maktir until Sorsha transformed once more. I'd worked with the folk of the castle to learn new skills. Grar's cousin, Gern, had started me on chariots. He was younger than Grar and was shopping for a worthy lord to serve. We weren't there yet, but we'd hit it off. And over the next month, time, I found myself able to fling javelins from chariot poles while the horse team was at a gallop, and then leap back into the car without grazing the tall helmet that Garen liked to wear. I wasn't yet up for backflips. I also wasn't ready to switch from cavalry to chariots full time just yet, but I enjoyed practicing the new skills and the rush of wind and thunder of wheels. No idea why the ancients on Mundania ever gave up these conveyances. Probably the lack of portals and shifting relatives that made them more practical in Otherworld, and less so on the poor roads that covered the long distances in ancient mortal times. I hadn't neglected Sorsha, of course. Lovely seal rather than perfect maiden though she was at the time, there was an exquisite lake below the high fortress. Water ran from a natural spring under and through the structure, and then over a precipice into a deep, cold body of water. From there it overflowed into a creek, and then developed into a small river, as it was fed by tributaries on the way to another, less dramatically high, but equally magnificent cliff, where it fell into a churning gray sea. My ancestral home was breathtaking. I explored it as much as I could while Sorsha stayed near and within the various waters. I recalled grandfather's admonition that I learn about water before I stray near, so I learned what I could from observation and from the tales of various folk and beings who dwelled on the land near the waves. The sprites were helpful, small and translucent. They played among the droplets of every place where the water splashed. Lovely creatures whose forms broke light into tiny rainbows that radiated from within their tiny bodies. They could grow when need or mood seized them, but they mostly wanted to play. It was a magical time, and despite her form, or maybe because of it, we bonded even more closely. There was no physical attraction, except for the eyes. Those were the same. And the hair color. Anyway, it gave us time to get to know one another without the hormones setting our hearts afire. We were in Fae terms, in the earliest stages of adolescence. For the moment, Sorsha couldn't speak in a language that I understood, at least at first. However, by paying careful attention, I learned to make out the meanings of many of her barks and squeals and undulating gestures. Then Midsummer's Eve arrived, and those of the Western Wolf Clan, under the liege of the Mactir Morg, celebrated long into the evening. Sorsha and I left the merriment behind us fairly early in the evening and made our way down to the sea. She was in need of water, and I in need of a walk. It was a long journey in miles, but Otherworld had a way of reducing the length of journeys. Something about the nature of the place. It was cold down by the sea, despite the season, and when she'd finished her swim and perched on the rocks to dry herself for a while, we sat beside one another, and I babbled on about what we would do when we got back to Mundania, and how I wanted so desperately to hear about all that had happened to her while she was held captive. I'd long since given her my portion of the tale. It got cold as the night deepened, and we both grew sleepy. I wrapped my cloak around our two bodies, and we shared the mammalian warmth as we slept until sunrise. I awakened to a naked Sorsha, curled up against me, using one of my arms for a pillow, while the other wrapped around so that my hand rested. Well, that's not really anyone else's business. The call to stand, shuffle forward, and take one last view of the bling-bedecked carcass, or loved one, interrupted my reverie. We shuffled up to the large casket with the 8 pallbearers standing to one side, and along with the rest, pretended to say our goodbyes. The pallbearers looked like the line from a football team. They'd need to be. Biggie S. was a heavy dude, and the casket was ornate and made of metal, flashy as a gangster's casket should be, especially when he'd fallen in the line of duty. I saw Sony seated on the front row among the family. I nodded to him courteously. Still couldn't manage genuine respect, but it would do for the show that was all most people needed or wanted. He nodded back gravely, putting on his own act, pretending to solemn dignity. He was definitely grieving for Biggie S., but he wanted to ensure that everyone saw him grieving appropriately, like some fairy tale king for a fallen knight. Shabil sat on the second row, just behind the official widow. He winked at me and tried to get me to laugh when I nodded to Sony. He almost succeeded. Dick move, but hilarious. I was glad he was on our side. I really didn't want to go to the graveside ceremony, and even more, I didn't want to go have a meal with the crew and affiliates, and the family, and their extensions. They might talk some business, but they were mostly there to give Biggie S. a good send-off and gorge off the fare that followed a funeral. I talked Sorsha into bolting as soon as we could get away from the throng of people now packed into the parking lot on their way to load up the cars and drive the 300 yards to the gravesite. The line of cars would be longer than the drive, so the funeral director would take the lead vehicle in a wide loop and help disperse them along the narrow lanes of the cemetery. We quickly found our way to her car and prepared to wait out the rest of the mourners, and then simply sneak out the exit into traffic. My mind wandered when I should have been alert. Wham! 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 Etc. in a staccato of automatic gunfire. The all too familiar and dreaded sound of shots fired rang out from the street in front of the funeral home complex. A gold SUV roared past, and 3 passengers in white jackets and red berets disappeared inside, tugging their little automatic weapon with them. There was a great deal of screaming and running and diving for cover. No one was hit beyond some wounds taken from broken glass and ricochets. There were more shouts of anger about damaged vehicles than cries regarding hurt bodies. Producing dead bodies hadn't been the point. The point was that the war was still on, and Sony's crew was losing. Serpente wanted to ensure that the message was received, and it likely was. A drive-by at a gangster funeral was so cliché, but I'm sure that if Biggie S. was in an afterlife and could see, he'd be proud he raided one. He'd been a righteous crude. I'd later snickered in memory of another old movie line I'd corrupted to my purpose. At the time, I was nearly apoplectic with anger. We left as soon as we could negotiate the jammed parking lot. I was seething. Serpente and his trash had put her in danger once more. I had enough reason to hate that dude, but now I was growing furious. It took all the control I possessed to hold back one of those rages, the fit that comes upon me and allows me to wipe out a small herd of kobolds and their large allies single-handedly. Serpente had not taken a direct role in Sorsha's abduction, but he'd allowed the kidnappers to pass through his turf in both Otherworld and Mundania with my sweetheart in tow, and he'd allowed them to employ a particularly dangerous creature from his lake to transport her, a kelpie. He could have stopped the foolishness, but had refused to help because discomforting the Mactir Moor was more fun to him than assisting a lady in distress. Besides, he wanted to stay in the good graces of a certain dark powers in Otherworld, especially his father. He'd likely taken some personal motives, lust for power and control, among his other sins that irked my ire, he'd sent his minion, the Lamaya, to murder Mercedes and to attack me, simply to dissuade me from interfering with his enterprises. He'd taken over Jaguar's human trafficking scheme in Mundania and made it even worse. There were rumors that he used many of the victims in sacrificial rites after he was done with the carnal users of their bodies. It was a good thing Sorsha was driving. She could see that I was a bubbling cauldron, more so than she'd ever witnessed. The worry that she might be afraid of me brought me back to some rationality. She placed her hand over mine, and I soon was well. She was my cure. We went back to her mother's home. Okay, her stepmother's. The woman's glamour would fade one day, and she would recall that she only had one daughter, unless Sorsha decided to renew it. I'd helped her put one on her regarding Shaban. We hadn't figured out how to tell her that her daughter had died on the threshold of Otherworld and that her remains were beyond recovery. We discussed a glamour to have her recall that a plane crash had killed Siobhan, but we'd have to extend it to Shane in case they wanted to discuss the matter. Others would have just settled for her being gone and taking Miss Ellie's word for the loss. I suggested that maybe a lost at sea scenario might work. Maybe she went on a cruise and never returned. There's always some hope to run alongside the misery of losing one's child. It was never our first priority. I really wished that Tom had been there to watch over Miss Ellie, but Sorsha told me that he actually visited only rarely, via a portal somewhere in the backyard or under the back part of the house. I wondered whether he would be willing to add the numerous stray cats of the city to our cause. They'd be able to take out some of Serpente's small-statured minions, like the Hatau, regardless of where His Majesty was. We had other priorities. First, I'd have to contact some of my old hood rat friends and gather our Mundanian allies. Sorsha was not going to like that, and I hadn't planned to take her along, but most of my turd friends were dedicated misogynists. In their words, women rarely did more than submit. It wasn't that they weren't tough, it's just that they were mostly kept from being awful enough to do what men did. Those that could manage it were infinitely worse but rare. The remnants of Sony's crew and the entirety of Shabal's Skittles crew combined was still no match for the numbers that Serpente now commanded. He'd taken the pitiful remains of Jaguar's crew, mostly affiliates, brought in his own soldiers, recruited other local crews to his side, and then consolidated the entire mess into a super crew, a veritable sewage treatment plant of criminality. I plan to recommend that we recruit some members of other organized criminal elements from other parts of the city. Perhaps the Kitsune or one of the other gangs I dealt with in the past. Shabil was the only one other than Serpente with the vision to deal with anyone outside his block. Maybe he'd have some contacts. So, Sorsha, sweetheart, I really need to go to the rough part of town to speak with my old compadres. She looked at me askance. And you believe that I would be only a liability in their eyes. However, I'm coming with you. We are a bonded pair, now more than ever. Besides, I was more offended than you were by being the object of a kidnapping like some baggage, not even a person. She raised a hand to forestall my arguments. I know how they are. You've warned me often enough, but you forget. You are not some mindless gangtard. You are a lord of the Fae, and I am a lady thereof. A full lady. I can glamour myself to be whatever we need me to be. Besides, we fight better alongside one another and could take out the measly threats any of the local arselings may present. I was thinking maybe I could be some other minion of Big Mac, she giggled. I can't believe that's what you call him. In front of Sony. I smiled and shrugged. Well, it was a stupid title for a stupid substratum of society. Your idea is actually really good. I would definitely feel better alongside you, though no smooching in front of the turds. Maybe we could call you Hot Shake. That got me. The tinkling laughter I'd longed for in her absence. The Seal version just didn't sound the same. Hey, it's Independence Day weekend. Maybe it would be a good time to go shoot off some fireworks. An opening salvo? From there, we made our own plans to offer the Criminal Council of Elders. I was in no position to lead the council. I had no crew, and as far as anyone but Shabil knew, I had nothing to offer beyond what any soldier might provide. Still, Shabil and Sunny both were aware that I'd taken out Jaguar and a big chunk of his crew, and rumors abounded that I was some kind of secret Assassin's Guild apprentice. Shabil knew about more of my genuine history, but Sony had seen me in action at the Battle of Bayview, so I got a seat at the table. Along with my Lieutenant Salty, a.k.a. Sorsha, I'd hinted that I could bring some forces to the fight when the time came. Some of the Western Wolf Clan might decide to go on the expedition. If Serpenta had otherworld troops, then I might be able to bring some of my own, perhaps some Nomen folk. I'd encounter Makta at Ker Maktir. It turned out she was what amounted to the major domo for the Maktir Moors' primary residence. She told me that some of the catfolk held me in high regard for taking out Kotka. Some she'd emphasized as though to leave me in doubt as to whether she was one of them. Cats. In any event, I was in the room when we made the big plan. We'd chosen a neutral territory in downtown so that we could invite some guests. The pre-meeting briefing with Shabil and Sony had been short. Shabil had encouraged me to lead that effort so that Sony would be the one to invite me to the big table. It worked, and we decided to meet with the Kitsune, whom Shabil informed, maybe warned me, were Fae of the Eastern Fox Clan. One of many Fox clans, just as I was part of one of many Wolf clans, see? It gets complicated in Otherworld. And what with the portals and crossroads often leading to other planets, we'd also invited a pretty rough outfit that had competed directly with Jaguar before his well-deserved demise. Their gang had split between those who wished to go with the clearly organized and ruthless Serpentine, and those who wanted to remain traditional, undisciplined gangsters. They didn't actually perform circus crimes other than hitting other crews and low-level civilians. They were freelancers, like I'd been, though they'd worked as teams and were entrepreneurs of murder rather than mere transportation. Together, an unpleasant bunch of rogues and bushers. I liked them. There were several minor crews and a small group of geezers that had been bikers back when that was a thing. They mostly smelled of meth and weed. Not necessarily from using, they were just dealers for the most part. Every single one was a graybeard. And several were missing limbs, teeth, ears, and eyes. Altogether, the assembled looked like a gathering of pirates. In a way it was. We were getting ready to raid the up-and-coming competition. Urgh, I rumbled, a wolfish internal growl of anticipation. The motley marauders had met and argued and sat sullenly and taken breaks to speak among their outfit. It had taken all of a day and most of a night to determine who was in and who would remain on the sidelines. We did not set a date or time for our opening salvo, at least until we had a committed core of cutthroats. We hoped it would surprise those who attended in bad faith, and the outright spies that Serpente's crew had no doubtably hidden among us, that we intended to attack that very night, as soon as we broke from the huddle. We intended to hike the ball. Mundanian tech was sketchy about detecting otherworld figures and structures, so our surveillance was limited. The portals helped to send signals haywire, and electronic images tend to blur or fail altogether. However, we had our own spies, and knew that the snaky butthole had demolished Jaguar's old junkyard arena and brothel, and replaced it with a modern complex that included a small pyramid inside the rectangle of a tall concrete wall. Lesser structures lined the inside of the wall, and there was still an arena at the base of the squat pyramid, the steps of which were part of the arena seating. A pool of water separated the arena floor from the base of the pyramid. There was only one big gate at the east entrance. There was a smaller one at the base of the pyramid at the west end. Lieutenant Falk had supplied much of the information based on what the city codes employees had seen before their manager rubber-stamped the project. He bought a new house with what Serpente used to bribe him. Falk had lower tech, but more effective means, and relayed some observations from various raptors that lived around the city and dined on the rodent population. Salty and I ended up with the dubious honor of taking the Sallyport, the west door. It definitely led directly inside the pyramid. It was an entrance and an escape hatch, though Serpente likely had others. It was hard to see. It blended well with the concrete wall and the murals painted thereon. I must admit that they were well done, if a little graphic and bloodthirsty. People, beings, and creatures dying from various unnatural causes, being sexually assaulted or submitting themselves to terrible beings of great power. Flames and streams of blood round through the imagery issued from the mouths of mythological beasts. I couldn't wait to destroy that fine artwork. Before we started, I tripped up to Wyoming to retrieve MB. He was game, still pissed that he hadn't been part of the final battle at the ziggurat inside the downtown high-rise, and in need of a fight to restore his confidence. One of the mayors, an exceptional half-faced specimen, had consented to carry Sorsha Salty. Fiona had been ready to sell her a very good price, but Sigrid, the mayor, wanted to have an adventure before she became a riding horse for some bored rich child of a former celebrity. We left them parked nearby and crept towards the back wall. There was very limited cover or concealment. Serpente, or his minions, had a military eye towards defense. We would have to settle and wait for a while until the main assault started. That was to be our signal. We stayed back in an alley near a noisome dumpster that was rolled against one wall. It was unpleasant, but we didn't have time to get overly nauseous before the battle began with a boom that coincided with the fireworks displayed that the city council had put together near downtown. The hit gang had access to military surplus from other countries, and they'd supplied a wonderful anti-tank missile to take out the east gates. I had the story from Shabil later. The gate was breached but didn't open as they'd hoped. His crew had driven up, used grapples to attach to the remnants of the barriers, and pulled the top of the things outwards until the panels crashed. Then Sony's SUV led the way into the serpent's lair. They drove along the south side of the complex and fired, all to the light to medium-range weapons they had into the structures and arena seats on the roof of the building. When the line slowed at the gate choke point, the rest began to peel away along the northern route. They met in the middle and poured everything they had at the entrance to the pyramid. In the meantime, before the echoes of the first explosions had finished rebounding, Sorsha and I started our foray against the back gate. A guy named Wahoo from the Greybeards had supplied us with an old-style anti-personal mine that had been adapted to blow the door if we could find no other way to open it. We got up close, and as an experienced burglar, I knew that the first way to try was simply to push and pull and turn any handles. Sometimes people left doors open. These had not, but the latch was fairly easy to finagle, and shortly the door opened inward on a dimly lit hallway. All too easy, I thought, satisfied that my felonious skills had not abandoned me. Then MB belled out a warning neigh, and I heard the loud thump of his hooves impacting the empty, malodorous dumpster. Salty and I whipped our heads towards the sounds and saw that the dumpster had shifted to the other side of the alley. An opening below where it had rested now disgorged several dark figures, one of which was too big to be mundane. It rose into the night and slithered up the wall like an enormous millipede until it reached the apex of the low structure on either side, then launched into the air, long and sinuous scaled body beneath feathered wings that had been wrapped around the length of a great body and now spread out to either side, like some feathered outer skin that the enormous serpent had shed, and yet still clung to its form along the spine. The wings were not wide, but extended along the entire length of the body, like an extended hood on a cobra. They were covered with feathers in every hue imaginable, between red and yellow. The scales on the body were golden and glittering. The nightmare head, shaped similarly to that of a hippopotamus, to include large pegged teeth, was pale and shone white against the darkness. It was the living nightmare image of one of the caravan heads at the complex of Tenochtitlan, just outside Mexico City. The head was of the same size as those stones at the complex, and the body stretched towards 30 feet. The other figure attacked the horses, but MB had the good sense to flee behind the mare, who had already startled and bolted. I took a moment to set down the charge in this little pack as the doors stop. I wedged the detonator inside the space between the door and the frame so that if anyone closed the door, the charge would blow. Then Salty, Sorsha, and I attacked the ambushers. I glanced up and saw that the plumed serpent, a.k.a. Quetzal, dragon, had made a circle and now shot down towards us as we crossed the opening space to the alley. It was a race, and the big creature was winning. Still, it couldn't do much unless it could breathe fire or spit poison or skim us into its jaws like a fishing bird. It wasn't big enough for that. But otherworld containers were tricky. So might be the maws of fey beasts. Sorsha dug something out of a pouch that bounced at her side, one of the selfsame small outer, voluminous interior pouches I'd just considered. She tossed it over her shoulder. There was a wheeze, and then a pail of smoke rose all around us. She seized my hand and dragged me towards the direction from which the Quetzal dragon approached. We cleared the smoke ring, even as we felt the rush of air when the monster passed just overhead. It felt like a roller coaster, and we were the tracks. There were shouts of anger and dismay from the alley, and our erstwhile opponents launched projectiles towards where we had been. We turned into the next alleyway and fled as fast as we could. It was narrower and more crowded with obstacles than the other, and we had to dodge and leap to negotiate the passage. I was onto the plan now, though. We were working flawlessly as a team. We passed the first turn back towards the other alley, and instead turned again to our left. We went up one and then finally made the loop back towards our opponents. Several times a large shadow passed overhead, and an ear-splitting roar set our nerves to jangling. As we made our way along a narrow passage back towards the first alley, a pair of large shadows loomed ahead, and a low rumble issued from one of them. We stopped and raised our unlimbered weaponry, prepared to fight. Then the teeth gleamed, and a whicker of low laughter issued. It was MB and Sigrid. We'd mounted gratefully, and now faster than our enemies could account for, sped towards the fight. The group of ambushers were composed of several large, slope-shouldered, bow-chested beings. Their heads were covered in plumes, and feathers sprouted from their bare arms. Their chests were reminiscent of a bird's rather than humans, and their backward-bending legs ended in heavy claws, like those of an ostrich or emu, made for running and kicking. They were essentially what terror birds would be had evolution been kinder to them. Apparently it had been, somewhere. We burst through the group and slashed and stabbed to either side. Sorcia turned out to be an excellent rider, and her lance drove home true. It split the breast of the creature on her left, even as it leapt for her. However, the one on her right sprang successfully and raked at her with both sets of razor claws. I'd used my broadsword to hack off the feet of the first one to reach me and leapt. It tumbled into a squawking ball of injured flesh that rolled behind MB and received the barest flick from his passing hooves. I slammed the point of the blade into the breast of the next one on my right, even as the second that faced Sorcia leapt. I couldn't get the weapon loose fast enough to help her. It didn't matter. She'd let go of her lance and had drawn her dagger. She couldn't avoid the impact, but she was able to let the bastard bird drive its own neck onto her blade when it tried to savage her with its beak. Then we were through. We wore light armor, and Sorcia was now rent, and she was bleeding from the side of her thigh. The saddle, just behind her right buttock, was torn down into the padding, but there was no blood flowing from Sigrid. Sorcia grinned. "I'm all right. The bruise will be worse than the laceration." She patted Sigrid in praise, and to comfort the brave but untrained mount. A noise and a hint of shadow attracted my gaze as I looked towards them and then beyond my lady. We'd been so busy with the flock of bird turds that we'd forgotten the Quetzal dragon. Sorcia saw my expression and turned to look. We were back in the opening between the wall to Serpente's compound and the opening to the alley. MB wheeled towards the alleyway and Sigrid followed. We made it inside and just past the dumpster when the Quetzal dragon finally showed its power. The area we'd just vacated lit behind us, not with fire, but with a direct beam of ultraviolet radiation that burned the way the hot sun does, with a long day of the hottest desert radiance concentrated into a single burst. It wouldn't melt anything metal or set a fire unless it was focused for a while, but it would fry flesh and singe it from the body and hair, and feathers would catch into momentary flames. The blast of blinding white radiance bathed the mouth of the alley for just a moment as the winged serpent passed. Fortunately, none of us looked back. It was already blinding enough with the rays that found their way to and around us. It was hot enough to feel, but not so intense outside the direct beam. Two of the bird folk carcasses that rested near the front of the alleyway roasted like Thanksgiving turkeys, only with the unpleasant odor of burning feathers and innards, as though someone forgot to remove the plastic-wrapped gibbet container before they placed the bird in the oven. We took the first right turn, and MB slowed but still moved rapidly. We circled back to the space between the older buildings and the compound wall at the next alley from the turkey roast. The shadow was gone. There was no sign of the avian reptile dread in the near sky view. We heard it again, but it was above the inside of the compound. No doubt it attacked our comrades at the first of the pyramid. This end of the assault was over, and Fubard. We rode back to take one last longing look at the open doorway that beckoned us inward to what was definitely a trap. I tried to decide to spring the trap and take our chances when from the interior figures crowded towards us. This bunch was more than a few guardians. It was a swarm of soldiers. I had picked up some skill with the javelin during our last sojourn in Otherworld. I drew one of the darts from MB's saddle holster and urged him towards the door. "Stay here. I'll be back," I called to Sorsha over my shoulder. Doubtless it looked like a foolhardy suicidal charge into the slavering mob that ran towards us from the interior of the pyramid. I let fly, and MB wheeled even as the last molecules of the javelin shaft parted from those of my hand. A crump soon sounded behind us to indicate that I'd struck the little pack and allowed the back door to the pyramid complex to close. I met with Sorsha, and we turned the horses towards the rendezvous point. I chanced to glance over my shoulder. The door had held, but something dark and liquid now seeped from beneath it and had begun to pool just in front. So quoth this raven. Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.